Why do you always smile?
Because somebody has to bring a little sunshine into this place.
Even when you're having a bad day?
Especially then.
Why do you always smile?
Because somebody has to bring a little sunshine into this place.
Even when you're having a bad day?
Especially then.
Evelyn, leave this place. You're not needed anymore.
Why? What have I ever done wrong?
For years, nobody noticed the woman who cleaned the hospital floors until the day she disappeared. Every morning she arrived before sunrise. Every night she left after everyone else had gone home. Doctors walked past her. Administrators ignored her. Patients barely looked at her. To them, she was just the cleaner, invisible, replaceable, forgettable. But the day she was fired and disappeared from the hospital, a secret buried for years began to surface. And when the hospital owner finally learned the truth, the entire hospital was forced to confront the way they had treated the woman who had quietly changed their lives. The first thing people noticed about St. Gabriel Medical Center was its reputation. The hospital was known across the city for its advanced equipment, famous surgeons, and wealthy donors. Patients traveled from far away just to be treated there. The building itself looked impressive. Glass walls, marble floors, bright lights. Everything about it projected success. What nobody noticed was the woman who spent every day making sure those marble floors stayed spotless. Her name was Evelyn Carter, a Black woman in her late 30s with kind eyes and a quiet smile. For nearly 10 years, Evelyn had worked as part of the hospital's cleaning staff. She arrived before dawn every day, long before the first doctors entered the building, long before patients filled the waiting rooms, long before executives parked their luxury cars outside. By the time everyone else arrived, Evelyn had already been working for hours, yet almost nobody knew her name. To most people, she was simply the cleaner, a person they passed without seeing, a person they spoke around rather than to, a person whose existence seemed limited to a mop and a cleaning cart. Evelyn never complained. She greeted everyone she met. Most ignored her. Some nodded politely. Very few ever stopped to talk. Still, she smiled. Every day, without fail. One rainy Tuesday morning, Evelyn was cleaning a hallway outside the pediatric wing when a little girl sitting alone in a wheelchair looked up at her. "Why do you always smile?" the child asked. Evelyn stopped pushing her cart. The girl couldn't have been older than 8. Her small face looked tired, the kind of tiredness children should never know. Evelyn knelt beside her. "Because somebody has to bring a little sunshine into this place." The little girl giggled. Outside, rain hammered the windows. Inside, for a brief moment, the hallway felt warmer. That was Evelyn's gift. She made difficult places feel lighter. Nurses noticed it, patients noticed it, children definitely noticed it, but management never did. To management, numbers mattered, reports mattered, budgets mattered, people like Evelyn didn't. The person who made that especially clear was Richard Bowman, the hospital's operations director. Richard believed every employee existed somewhere on a ladder. Doctors stood at the top, executives stood near them, everyone else filled the lower rungs, cleaning staff occupied the bottom, and Richard never let them forget it. Whenever he walked through the hospital, employees straightened immediately. People feared him, his sharp suits, his cold voice, his constant criticism. He rarely smiled. And when he did, it usually meant bad news for someone. One afternoon, Evelyn accidentally crossed paths with him while cleaning outside a conference room. Richard stopped, looked at the freshly mopped floor, then looked at her. "You missed a spot." Evelyn glanced down. There wasn't a spot. Still, she apologized. "I'm sorry, sir." Richard shook his head. "People like you always have excuses." Then he walked away. Several employees nearby heard the exchange. Nobody said anything. Nobody defended her. Evelyn simply continued working. But moments like that happened often, far too often. The strange thing was that Richard's treatment never seemed to affect her attitude. She remained patient, kind, professional, as if she understood something everyone else didn't, as if she knew her worth wasn't determined by how others treated her. Months passed. Then one morning, a major announcement spread through the hospital. The owner of St. Gabriel Medical Center, billionaire businessman Alexander Whitmore would be visiting. The news created excitement everywhere. Doctors prepared presentations, executives organized meetings, administrators rushed through endless checklists. The hospital wanted everything perfect, especially Richard Bowman. For an entire week, Richard became even more demanding than usual. Every department felt the pressure, including cleaning staff, particularly Evelyn. One afternoon, while preparing for the owner's visit, Richard found a supply cart parked temporarily near the executive corridor. The cart belonged to Evelyn. She had stepped away briefly to help an elderly patient who had dropped his medication. When Richard saw the cart, his face darkened. Employees nearby immediately recognized trouble, and for the first time in years, Evelyn was about to become the center of it. The moment Richard Bowman saw the cleaning cart, his face hardened. Several employees nearby immediately lowered their eyes. They knew what was coming. Richard walked toward the cart as though he had discovered something offensive. The hallway was spotless. The cart wasn't blocking anyone. It wasn't creating a hazard, but none of that mattered. Richard wasn't looking for a problem. He was looking for someone to blame. At that exact moment, Evelyn was helping an elderly patient gather medication that had fallen across the floor. The old man struggled to bend down. His hands shook badly. Without hesitation, Evelyn had stopped her work to help him. She knelt beside him patiently, gathering each bottle one by one. The man smiled gratefully. "Thank you," he said. "My daughter usually helps me." Evelyn smiled back. "You're welcome." The old man looked at her carefully. "You are always helping people." Before Evelyn could respond, a loud voice echoed down the corridor. "Evelyn!" The entire hallway fell silent. Doctors turned, nurses stopped walking, patients looked up. Everyone recognized Richard's voice, and everyone knew someone was about to be embarrassed. Evelyn stood slowly. She already knew who was calling. When she reached the executive corridor, Richard was waiting. His arms folded, his expression cold. The cleaning cart stood behind him, like evidence in a criminal investigation. "What is this?" Richard demanded. Evelyn glanced at the cart. "I'm sorry, sir. I was helping a patient." Richard laughed sharply. "A patient?"
Several people had gathered nearby, watching, listening. Nobody intervened. "You abandoned your duties," Richard said. "I was gone less than 5 minutes. That isn't your decision to make." Evelyn remained calm. Years of experience had taught her that arguing only made people like Richard worse. Still, something felt different today. The anger in his eyes seemed larger, more personal, as if he had been waiting for an opportunity. "The hospital owner arrives in 2 days," Richard continued. "Everything must be perfect. I understand. Do you?" His voice grew louder. "Because all I see is someone who consistently fails to understand basic instructions." Several employees shifted uncomfortably. The criticism wasn't fair. Everyone knew it. Evelyn was one of the most reliable workers in the building. But nobody spoke. Fear kept them silent. Richard stepped closer. "For years this hospital has tolerated mediocrity." The hallway became painfully quiet. Then he said the words that changed everything. "Maybe it's time that ended." Evelyn felt something tighten inside her chest. Not fear, not anger, recognition. Somehow she knew what was coming next. Richard reached into a folder he was carrying, removed a document, and handed it to her. "Effective immediately, your employment is terminated." The hallway froze. Even the nurses looked shocked. Evelyn stared at the paper. For several seconds she didn't move. 10 years. Gone. Just like that. Around her, people exchanged nervous glances. Nobody expected this. Not even Richard's biggest supporters. Evelyn finally looked up. "May I ask why?" Richard didn't hesitate. Poor performance. The answer was absurd. Everyone knew it. But Richard spoke it with complete confidence, as though repeating a lie enough times made it true. Evelyn lowered her eyes to the paper again. Her hands remained steady. which surprised even her. The truth was, she felt strangely calm, as though something inside her had already accepted this moment before it arrived. Richard interpreted her silence differently. You may collect your belongings. No thank you. No acknowledgement of 10 years of service. Nothing. Just dismissal. Like she had never mattered. Evelyn nodded once, then quietly walked away. Behind her, the hallway remained silent. The people who watched her leave felt uncomfortable. Ashamed, perhaps. But nobody stopped her. Nobody defended her. And that hurt more than losing the job. An hour later, Evelyn exited St. Gabriel Medical Center carrying a small box. A few personal photographs. A coffee mug. A framed picture drawn by a child patient years earlier. That was all. 10 years reduced to a cardboard box. Rain had started falling again. The same gentle rain from the morning. Evelyn stood outside the hospital entrance for a moment. Looking up at the building, she remembered her first day. How nervous she had been. How proud she felt to work there. How hard she had tried. Now it was over. Slowly she walked away and disappeared. The next morning, the hospital felt different. Nobody could explain why. That something was missing. Nurses noticed first. The pediatric patients asked where Evelyn was. Several elderly patients asked the same question. Even doctors who rarely spoke to her found themselves noticing the absence. No smile in the morning. No quiet greetings. No warm presence moving through the hallways. The hospital suddenly felt colder. 3 days later, billionaire owner Alexander Whitmore arrived. The visit began exactly as planned. Executives greeted him. Doctors presented reports. Administrators discussed expansion projects. Everything looked perfect, at least on the surface. Then something unexpected happened. Alexander stopped walking, his eyes fixed on a wall near the pediatric wing. A framed photograph hung there. It showed hospital staff during a charity event years earlier. Doctors, nurses, administrators, and standing near the edge of the picture, Evelyn. Alexander stared at the image. A strange expression crossed his face. Recognition, confusion, then concern. He pointed toward the photograph. Where is she? Nobody understood. Richard stepped forward. Who, sir? Alexander pointed directly at Evelyn. The woman in that picture. Richard hesitated. She's no longer employed here. The billionaire's expression changed immediately. No longer employed. Richard nodded. She was terminated recently. For several seconds, Alexander said nothing. The atmosphere shifted. Executives exchanged nervous glances. Something felt wrong. Very wrong. Then Alexander asked a question nobody expected. Who authorized that decision? Richard suddenly felt uneasy. I did. The billionaire's eyes narrowed. The silence that followed felt heavier than any meeting room. Because the look on Alexander Whitmore's face wasn't disappointment. It was shock. The kind of shock that comes when someone learns something impossible. Then he quietly asked, Do you have any idea who that woman is? And for the first time since firing Evelyn, Richard Bowman felt afraid. The conference room became completely silent. Richard Bowman felt every eye in the room turn toward him. The billionaire owner's question still hung in the air. Do you have any idea who that woman is? Richard swallowed. No, sir. Alexander Whitmore stared at him for a long moment. Then he slowly sat down. For the first time that day, the confident billionaire looked emotional, almost shaken. The executives exchanged confused glances. Nobody understood what was happening. Finally, Alexander spoke. 8 years ago, my daughter nearly died. The room remained silent. Everyone listened. She was 11 years old. His voice softened. She had a rare blood condition. There were complications after surgery. Her doctors were running out of options. Several people in the room had never heard this story before. Alexander rarely discussed his personal life. Her blood type was extremely difficult to match. The hospital searched everywhere. He paused, then continued. Someone volunteered immediately. Richard shifted uncomfortably. Alexander's eyes hardened. That person was Evelyn. The room froze. A nurse gasped softly. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Alexander continued. My daughter survived because of that donation. The silence grew heavier. At the time, Evelyn specifically requested that nobody tell me. Several executives looked stunned. Why? One doctor asked quietly. Alexander smiled sadly. Because she said she didn't help my daughter for recognition. The room fell silent again. Alexander looked toward the photograph. She said every life mattered equally. No one knew what to say. Because the woman they barely noticed had once saved the life of the owner's child. And she had never told anyone. Never used it for personal gain. Never mentioned it. Richard felt his stomach tighten. For the first time, he remembered every harsh word he had ever spoken to her. Every public humiliation. Every moment he treated her like she was insignificant. The memories suddenly felt unbearable. Alexander stood. Find her. His voice was calm, but firm. Immediately, the search began that afternoon. Calls were made. Records were checked. Former employees were contacted. But finding Evelyn wasn't easy. She had moved on quietly, the same way she had always lived. Without attention. Without attention. Without noise. Without demanding recognition. Days passed. Then weeks. The hospital continued operating. But the atmosphere had changed. Word of Evelyn's story spread quickly. Doctors talked about it. Nurses talked about it. Patients talked about it. Many were shocked. Others felt ashamed. People began sharing stories. Small stories. Stories they had never thought were important before. A nurse remembered how Evelyn stayed late comforting frightened children. A doctor remembered seeing her buy food for a patient who couldn't afford lunch. An elderly patient remembered her sitting beside him for an hour when he felt alone. The stories kept coming. And with each story, one truth became clearer. The hospital had overlooked one of the best people who ever worked there. Not because she lacked value, but because they never bothered to look. Meanwhile, Richard Bowman barely slept. Every morning he arrived at work carrying a weight that grew heavier. The hospital staff noticed the change. The arrogant confidence was gone. The coldness was gone. In its place was something unfamiliar. Regret. Real regret. 1 month later, the breakthrough finally came. A former employee recognized Evelyn's name during a conversation. She was working at a community health center on the other side of the city. The center served low-income families, people who couldn't afford expensive medical care. The moment Alexander received the information, he left immediately. No assistance. No media. No publicity. Just a father who wanted to thank the woman who had once saved his child. When he arrived, the building looked nothing like St. Gabriel Medical Center. The paint was faded. The equipment was older. The waiting room was crowded. But the place felt alive. Warm. Human. And there, walking through the hallway with a box of supplies in her hands, was Evelyn. Alexander recognized her instantly. For a moment, he simply stood there, watching. She looked exactly the same. The same calm smile. The same kindness. The same quiet dignity. Finally, he stepped forward. Evelyn. She turned. Surprised. Their eyes met. For a brief moment, neither spoke. Then recognition appeared on her face. Mr. Whitmore. Alexander smiled. You remember me? Evelyn nodded politely. Of course. The billionaire looked emotional. More emotional than he expected. May we talk? A few minutes later, they sat together in a small office. Alexander looked around. The furniture was simple. The room was modest. Yet Evelyn seemed completely at peace. "I spent weeks looking for you," he said. She smiled gently. "I'm not very difficult to find." Alexander laughed softly. Then his expression became serious. "I learned what you did for my daughter." Evelyn looked down briefly, as if the subject embarrassed her. "You saved her life." "I helped." "You saved her life." Tears filled Alexander's eyes. "I never thanked you." For the first time, Evelyn looked genuinely uncomfortable. "That wasn't necessary." Silence settled between them. Then Alexander took a deep breath. "Evelyn, I also learned how you were treated." She didn't answer immediately. Finally, she said softly, "People don't always see what's in front of them." The words hit Alexander harder than any accusation. Because she wasn't angry. She wasn't bitter. And somehow that made everything worse. Weeks later, Alexander invited Evelyn back to St. Gabriel Medical Center. This time, she accepted. The entire hospital gathered in the main auditorium. Doctors, nurses, administrators, support staff, hundreds of people. Many had never seen the hospital so full. When Evelyn walked onto the stage, the room erupted into applause. A standing ovation followed. Some employees wiped tears from their eyes. Others lowered their heads in shame, because they remembered how easily they had ignored her. Alexander stepped to the microphone. For years, this hospital celebrated titles, positions, and achievements. The room became quiet. But we failed to recognize one of the finest people who ever walked these halls. He turned toward Evelyn. "This woman reminded us that character matters more than status." The applause returned. Then something unexpected happened. Richard Bowman stood up. Slowly, nervously. The entire auditorium watched. He walked to the stage, stopped in front of Evelyn, and lowered his head. The man who once humiliated her in public now struggled to speak. "I'm sorry." The room fell silent. Richard's voice trembled. "I judged your position instead of your character." He looked up. His eyes were full of regret. "I treated you unfairly." The silence deepened. Then Evelyn smiled gently. Not because she had won. Not because he deserved forgiveness. But because she had already made peace with the past. "For years," she said softly, "I thought losing my job was the worst thing that could happen to me." The audience listened carefully. But sometimes life's greatest setbacks become the beginning of something better. Many nodded. She looked around the room. At the doctors, the nurses, the staff, the people who once overlooked her. "I forgive you." A few people began crying, including Richard. The burden he had carried for months finally broke. Evelyn stepped away from the microphone. And in that moment, something changed inside the hospital. Not because a cleaner had been honored, but because people finally understood a lesson they should have learned long ago. A person's value is not determined by a title, not by a uniform, not by their position. It is determined by their character. As Evelyn left the auditorium that afternoon, employees stopped her throughout the hallway. Some thanked her. Some apologized. Others simply introduced themselves for the first time. And for the first time in 10 years, nobody called her the cleaner. They called her by her name. Evelyn. The woman they never saw. Until she was gone. Moral lesson. Never judge a person's worth by their job title or social status. The people we overlook today may be the very people who make the greatest difference in our lives. Respect should be given freely, because true greatness is found in character, kindness, and integrity. I'd like to ask, what would you have done if you were Evelyn? Would you have forgiven Richard and the hospital staff, or would you have walked away for good? Let us know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more powerful stories that remind you what truly matters in life.